put a time limit on it at what, about 2:15?
Yeah.
I think probably about 2:15. Now, I take this to be an important kind of lunchtime discussion, not simply because I also teach in the graduate school, but because in a way one of the things we have to think about in the coming months is really the relationship between the main school and the graduate school. Now, as you may be kind of dimly but not precisely aware, over the recent history of the AA, the kind of ratio between the two in terms of student numbers has changed dramatically. The graduate school constitutes a far higher proportion of the total kind of student community in the school, and that was kind of dramatically increased by the introduction of the DRL and the very kind of buoyant kind of applications for it. At the same time, in general terms, the other programs have expanded and have also been supplemented by the MTech and the landscape urbanism. At the same time, the PhD program has both grown, and this year is part of a sort of relaunched PhD program, which is no longer an adjunct to each of the MA programs, but constitutes a graduate school-wide program as a whole. Now, one of the problems, I think, if there is a problem in the discussions that we've had so far in the kind of educational symposium, is that sort of strange way is that people start off talking about the AA, but it very soon turns into a discussion about the diploma school. And somehow everything kind of seems to sort of radiate from that. Now, this session at least should bend the stick backwards and try to look at the AA in a way from the point of view of the graduate school. It's very important, I think, that the last point I made before kind of handing it over is that I think many people from different points of view would kind of observe that one of the problems we have is that in the past, the two parts have not been very productively or creatively or imaginatively linked. And one of our ambitions in the graduate school is really that the kind of links and the exchange between the graduate school and the main school is one that becomes kind of much greater. Okay, that's enough of me. I'm going to, we've got three speakers, Brett, Bob, George, all of who are known to you. I'm going to ask George to start off.
Okay. Okay. You are familiar with the format of these lunch conversations, and the idea is that we are supposed to raise a few issues, suggestions or proposals for discussion, with very few minutes to do that. So I decided to basically use those few minutes to concentrate in one issue that I want to suggest should be at the center of the discussion about the future of graduate studies in the AA, and in a sense also about the redefinition or renewal of the relationship between graduate studies and undergraduate studies in the AA. And this is the question, essentially, of the relation between teaching and research within the graduate school. That's the subject I want to elaborate a little bit with very general proposals and suggestions. I think before moving into that, I think in the last few days, in the last 2 weeks, a lot has been said, a lot has been discussed in this room about what makes the AA as an institution, the AA as a school, such a special institution and school? What has underpinned in the different moments of our very long history, and by the way, far beyond the 30 or 40 years that have been the focus of the recent conversations, what has made possible for the AA to be in the forefront of architectural education, to develop such an innovative edge, its ability to debunk existing ideas in the field of architecture and urbanism, the experimental nature of the school. You know? Jeff Kipnis talked about a conjectural school. Peter Cook yesterday was talking about this hot house. What makes this possible? And I think what is interesting, and all through these discussions, for me at least, it became very evident, is that it is extremely difficult to pinpoint which factor or combination of factors has made possible in the different moments of our history this magic, fragile, ability to be in the forefront of architectural education. And I say that because, as a note of caution, I think often we tend to immediately transform into an absolute argument about what are the key factors that make that possible. I would say there is no single factor, there is no single combination of factors, and this is what is interesting. In every one of those moments, there has been sometimes very different combination of factors, and almost every single element has changed in terms of structures of management, in terms of teaching methods, the unit system, not the unit system, in terms of composition of staff, in terms of the demographics of the students in this school, in terms of the very hot issue of the relation of the school with outside bodies, the independence of the school, the relation with founding agencies, the relation with accreditation bodies, the relation with validating processes. Almost all of these aspects have changed over time. And so it's very difficult, really, and we should be careful not to oversimplify this discussion. Don Bates, 2 days ago, you probably all remember when he said something that we all, I think, immediately understood what he was talking about, when he said he was worried a few years ago that the AA would try to become another Harvard. And I think we understood and we agreed with him. And yet, I would argue that it's not so immediately self-evident what one should do to avoid becoming another Harvard, or what we would do that would immediately make us into yet another Harvard. I think when we discuss about graduate studies, that becomes very important, because I think some of the issues that the graduate school is facing can be seen as an attempt to reproduce in the AA things that happen in other parts of the architectural education in the world. And I would argue that that's not the case, and I think it depends very much the content we give to some of these things we do here at the AA. What is graduate studies all about? I mean, I would argue that it's fundamentally about two things. It's about furthering the professional and intellectual skills and capacity of people operating on a given field or discipline. But it is also, and this is very important, about contributing to the development of ideas within that field. It's exactly that relation between the education, the teaching, the training component, and what I would call the research component that, in my view, is so important, and what I want to make a few comments here today. Yet that relation has not always been present in graduate education in general, or in the field of architecture and urbanism in particular. In a sense, one could say that architecture and urbanism are latecomers to graduate education, almost everywhere in the world. And it's also true that the connection between teaching and research within graduate studies in architecture and urbanism has been much slower than in other fields and disciplines. In fact, we could say that even today, many, if not most, of the graduate schools, if you just look around in Europe, I would say are very much about teaching, are very much programs that try to present the state of the art in particular areas of specialization, rather than centers of research. In many ways, one could argue that became even more so under the pressures of the last decade, when there has been a huge expansion in demand for graduate education in architecture and urbanism. This, again, is another international trend. It has happened almost everywhere. A huge expansion is the area of expansion and growth in architectural education almost everywhere. And the Architectural Association is not an exception to any of those trends. If we think graduate studies in the AA proper, it started around 30 years ago. If we then think that really courses leading to recognize degrees of international equivalence is something that only happened in the last 10 to 15 years. PhDs first, and then master courses. The relation in the AA between teaching and research in the graduate school has been also very slow to happen, and not accidentally happened, or start happening in the last decade. But I would argue today, and suggest to you as a subject of conversation, that articulation, which I believe to be the main challenge for the AA at the moment, has been very incipient for a series of reasons in the last decade. Things start happening. I think we have in the graduate school programs, especially the studio-based programs, that are trying to develop research through teaching. Many of us have been able to do individual research, getting bits of funds here and there, but very much as a sort of ad hoc, sporadic, quite incipient sort of research work. There is also, we have to say, the presence of the PhD program, and in particular, the recent changes in the PhD program that, in my view, are contributing towards greater integration between research and teaching, or at least the potential is there. But on the whole, I would argue that in the evolution of the graduate school and graduate studies in the AA, research as a systematic component of our work has been relatively weak. The trend of increasing in numbers, Mark already made reference to that. In the AA, again, was no exception to the trend. In the last decade, numbers of programs, areas of specialization of students have increased quite considerably. And we have at the moment a graduate school with several programs, I would say a very diverse, very strong, high-quality graduate school. In fact, the new direction of this school, I think, would inherit, on the whole, a very healthy graduate school. Yet, I think we are in the threshold and facing the need, I want to suggest, to move forward and to face new challenges. Here there are many of you that are not familiar with the history of the graduate school. We don't have the time to go through that, but very telegraphically I would like to say that, in a sense, the graduate school has gone through at least so far 3 stages. Before the existence of the graduate studies, before the existence of the graduate school, we had the School of Tropical Architecture and the Planning Department in the school. I would say they were very much within the tradition of training, professional training and specialization courses. The graduate school in the mid-70s, when it comes, is really the first systematic attempt to have full-time graduate education, academically solid, comprehensive courses, etc. It's also a very interesting period when our chairman of the time, Boyarsky, tries to explore what it means to really set up a graduate design program as opposed to design as it was then in the undergraduate school. We then move into a third stage in the late 80s and early 90s, which again, in view of the need to really compete with other schools, to be able to really provide degrees that would have international equivalence and recognition, we had to move into a period of validation of our courses, and an entirely different ball game start taking place there in terms of searching for academic validation, restructuring the ways we operated, etc., etc. And I think quite successfully we did that, and the school has become much stronger. But again, if there is anything special about the graduate school, beyond just being part of this wonderful institution, the AA, I would say that in each one of those 3 periods, the elements that came together to make that possible were quite different. And the argument I want to present to you is a very simple one, is that I want to suggest that the school is ripe, the graduate school is ripe, to move into a 4th stage, which in my view should be fundamentally a research-led graduate school. That we really have to attempt to develop in a very systematic and rigorous manner research within the graduate school in a way in which our courses, teaching programs, become very much, not exclusively, but fundamentally testing ground of our research within graduate school. I think the challenge is how to create a diverse set of research program, one that really tries to explore the edges of our disciplines, of our areas of specialization. I would refer you to the presentation of Jeff Kipnis and his definition of what basic research is about, and I think there were some interesting ideas there. That idea of be able to develop research that is systematic, is rigorous, but also take risks, is about is destabilizing in many respects. And I think the AA has a tradition of that, and I think in the graduate school the elements are ripe to try to do that. The point is that if we want to do that, that cannot happen spontaneously again. How do we create the conditions for that to happen? We need to support institutionally such effort in research. We need to establish the institutional mechanisms to both promote and manage research. We need to establish the mechanisms to procure resources for research. We have to approach the question of staffing in graduate school in a different manner. I'm not here referring to questions of contracts, one-year contracts or not. In fact, personally, I don't think there is any problem with one-year contracts. I think the history of the school shows that one-year contracts have not conspired against continuity of thinking, of teaching, of working, of researching in many ways within the undergraduate and graduate school. But I do think that if we really want to promote research, not as something that happens in our free times, between midnight and 5 in the morning, with little bits of money from here and there as a result of individual efforts. If we want to do it systematically, the whole question of staffing within the graduate school, of select our staff and support our staff, means that researching becomes very much part and parcel of their responsibilities and contracts, something that doesn't exist at the moment. I will finish in 2 minutes. I want to say that, in my view, if we were to face this challenge and really try to enhance the articulation between research and teaching within the graduate school, I think we would be also enhancing considerably the possibility of a much, much richer interaction between graduate studies and undergraduate in the school. A lot has happened in recent years, in the last decade. I think there is a lot of collaboration happening between the graduate and undergraduate units, units working together, doing workshops together, traveling together, joint tutoring, not least because many tutors now work in the graduate and in the undergraduate school. Joint events, etc., etc. But I think on the whole, that relation is not yet as rich as it should be. And I would argue that enhancing the work of research could also connect much more explicitly to certain lines and clusters of research within the undergraduate school, respecting the differences in the methods of teaching and research in the graduate and undergraduate. And I would also suggest that perhaps general studies has to be, in some ways, rethought to accommodate that interaction between graduate and undergraduate through more systematic research at graduate level. A final word in terms of academic management. Many of you are familiar with that, but perhaps many are not. The graduate school in its 3rd stage, to be able to achieve academic validation, we had to create an intermediate structure of management that's called the Graduate Management Committee. which has been extremely important and relevant in creating conditions for the development of the graduate school. But also what is interesting is that not only did GMC, as it is called, became the central instrument of running and managing graduate studies in the AA, but also create new possibilities of communication and participation within the graduate school that didn't exist before. And I think the GMC provides an interesting institutional basis to develop some of these ideas about research, but also I would say in discussing about reform of structures of management in the A, we should look at the experience of the GMC. I know that many people are reticent to do that. They consider the GMC is very much specific to the graduate school and its idiosyncratic nature. I would say that's possibly true. It's not a question of replicating the GMC, but I think the GMC does provide to the school an example of an intermediate structure of management that has been extremely complementary and in fact has a strengthening the possibility of efficient management by the chairman's office, and has ensured a level of communication and discussion within the graduate school that didn't exist before. I think we talked a lot the other day in the panel about constitutional matters. There was a lot of talk about participatory democracy, direct democracy, etc., etc. In my view, this becomes absolutely meaningless if we don't have in the school structures and procedures, processes to ensure that that democratic participation takes place on a more continuous basis. And I think those intermediate structures of management can be quite fundamental to achieve that. So I finished there. I'm sorry if I exceed my time.
Okay, thank you very much. Bob, would you like to comment?
Well, all that thing about research informing teaching, I'm very skeptical about, because whatever it was, 20 or 35 or 30 years ago, 1958, I began teaching here, and it was the big question at that time. Research was essential to expand architectural education. Well, we've had research established at government level. All the schools of architecture started doing research, and this year the University of Cambridge are closing down the MPhil course in architecture, history and theory because they are not doing enough research. Cambridge University is going to pieces. It's the second best school in the country. I won't tell you which is the best school in the country. I started teaching in 1958, and I was second-year master here for a couple of years. We studied the village at Penn Street. We studied the village somewhere in Kent, forget the name of it. I taught people like Michael Hopkins, Edward Jones, Jeremy Dixie. A lot of people did very well out of that teaching, but not me. I got stuck on the idea of teaching and learning as a process. Teaching and learning.
Learning.
And I moved to University College in 1962, hoping to be able to establish some connection between them. The opposition of teaching and learning arises from a defensive posture on the part of the teacher or learner. The teacher must accept that his task will be accomplished only if he devotes at least a part of his effort to overcoming the noise, and to limiting channel capacity, as well as emitting a message that's pure and good. So I think that you will all understand what I mean about noise. Any of you who might be taking notes here, and compare the notes that you're taking about this session afterwards, you'll find that they're widely different. Why? Because everybody has a subjective intake, and we all fall asleep from time to time, or we all think about our friends, our girlfriends, or boyfriends from time to time, and that interrupts the flow of things. So there's a lot of noise in teaching, and this is so even in teaching a hard subject like Spanish, for instance. I get nowhere with learning Spanish, but I want to speak Spanish, no mucho, you know. It always turns out to be Italian that I think I'm speaking. And so I have a problem with learning Spanish, but you might think that teaching somebody Spanish would be a very simple thing. They're motivated to learn, and you're motivated to teach, and within, one term, you're in Spain, having a good time, and learning it with the natives, which of course is the only way to really learn. So we're talking about noise in the system when it comes to learning something hard. Now, I think that it's quite different when we come to design, and I've spent most of my life teaching design. I think that the wise teacher will develop a dialectical framework for teaching and learning in which the two modes of action are made to alternate and interact. So you're not always teaching and you're not always learning. You're teaching yourself, of course, as well. If you're not entering into your own teaching, it's going to get nowhere. But there's a sort of cycle of trying things out and seeing if they work. Now, in architecture, whether things work or not has always been very conditional. I say it would work. The critic here says that won't work. It's always a conditional thing. You can't take designs and subject them to a kind of scientific examination. You can't say, it's failed. The way Jane Warwick was very successful last year when she got you all to design, or some of you, maybe somebody who did it, design a bridge out of spaghetti. And then you load the bridge, and at a certain point it collapses. It's very, very convincing. Failure demonstrated before your eyes. We never get that in architecture. The best teaching I ever saw operating in that sense was when I was invited to be a jury at the Kingston School of Fashion Design, and I was on the jury, and we had people who were designing clothes, right? They did wonderful presentation drawings. This was the era when people wearing clothes in fashion pictures were Little Miss Muffets, and they had red little pink patches on their cheek. It was that period of time. And we judged the drawings, and we thought this was good, this wasn't good. But then we also had the same clothes made up and worn by models. Some of the students modeled in the same design. Now that's quite different. That is the design as if it was built. And so you could judge not only the drawings, but the effect of wearing the clothes. That was a terrific insight to me. How could one judge the effect of having a piece of architecture? There has never been an empirical way of testing design in that sense. We've had from 1962, when I went to the Bartlett, hoping there would be developed a relationship with design. It has never happened. Design has failed to learn from research. I don't dispute what George says about it being a good idea, but I don't see it happening. The other thing I would say here is that this was what we were aiming to do in 1962. I went to the Bartlett hoping to institute computer-aided design. I was very interested in computers in those days, but University of London, University College, was into number crunching. Huge computers, big computers. They were wanting to solve the Big Bang or some question like that. And it wasn't until long after I left the Bartlett and went to America that they discovered they'd do better to have a number of small interactive computers with desktops, you know? And so they split up the computer, and everybody had their own computer, and then you begin to get computer action, and you begin to get computer active design, and it's now been very successful at the Bartlett. So what I would say about all that is that everything takes longer than you expect. It takes longer. It takes longer for design and research to come together. They haven't come together yet. It takes longer for architecture to develop a rational structure which would involve a framework for teaching whether a building works or not. We don't know what makes a building work. And at the same time, there is something that's happening in the outside world. Functionalism is coming to an end, which was the theory of most of the 20th century, functionalism. Now, buildings are designed for their overall shape and look. They're propaganda. The Swiss Re building is an example. I said this to Spencer de Grey last night at dinner. He said, "You must come and tell Norman that." I can see me telling Norman that. Well, but Spencer is open to ideas in a sort of managerial way. Everything takes longer than we expect. And in design or architecture, there's a further thing which complicates it, and this is the fact that not only do we try to make it work, which we have to imagine what will work or not, but we also try to make it look nice or look interesting. Probably more looking interesting than looking nice. We used to try and make it look nice. Now you try to make it look interesting. And what I'm talking about here is that side of research which has nothing to do with scientifically evaluating the future and predicting, but it's the research of an artist like Jackson Pollock. Tadeo Ando spoke last night at the Imperial College, and he said that discovering about Jackson Pollock was what put him onto the future in architecture. And he showed a picture of Jackson Pollock, very well dressed, no splashes of paint on his clothes, dribbling paint onto a canvas without getting dirty. That's quite a thought, because the canvases are more accident than anything else. Interesting accident, perhaps, and that's one of the things about interest in accident. Accident is unexpected, and the unexpected is always interesting. So how to make something unexpected is how to make it interesting. And this is a state we're at today when architecture and architectural students are trying hard not only to do architecture and make things work, but to do art in their architecture and make things look mysterious. I had a good chance to clarify this for myself on Tuesday last night and Tuesday when I was at a lecture given by Peter Eisenman. And I had the last question. I'm very good at picking the last question. Just time for one more question. And my head picks up. And I said, Peter, I think that you're engaged in two contradictory activities. First of all, you take the site, you take the grid, you take a notional grid, you lay it on the site, and then you lay the contours on the site, and then you lay the city plan on the site, and you complicate it, and you make a form which is completely complex and ununderstandable. I said, and then you go over to change gear and go over to making everything normal, making everything as we would expect it. The space where you're told to have an opera theater, you make an opera theater with stage house and place for the scenery, and it all works. So half his time is spent making a mystery, which nobody will understand, but which is intriguing. And then the second half of his time is spent putting an architectural function on top of that and making it work. So making it work and making it look mysterious are two quite different things, and I think architectural students get phased by this because part of the time they really want to make it work, but part of the time they don't want anybody to understand too quickly what they've done. They want to make a mystery. So I'm coming to an end now. At this point, I think you have to decide what you want to do in architecture, and that would be something for architectural students to have a view on. Architectural students who are going through the process are interested in it, and once they've gone out of the process and become architects or critics or fashion designers or something else, they will forget about the problems they had when they were trying to learn about buildings and how to make buildings work. They'll forget about it, they won't be interested in, and so all the stuff will go under the water, under the bridge, and be lost again. Everything is all the time being lost. So to dedicate yourself to research, you might begin by asking what it is you're doing as a student. What are you doing as a student? And when you are learning to design, how do you learn it? That would be research. That would be real research if you could express that. Maybe write a paper or give a lecture or join in a symposium like me now. Think about it.
Brett.
Thank you. I'm going to address the question of the graduate school and its relationship to the AA through really one specific topic today, which is one I know fairly intimately. The graduate school is a diverse place across 8 different programs. My interest today is graduate design, which is the topic I've been working on for several years here, obviously in the context of the DRL. And we certainly are interested in the topic of research on a daily basis, and I'll try and go through some of the ways we've been thinking about it in the organization of the course. Maybe the first point to make today regarding the topic of graduate design is that I think it's important to stress that grad design as I would understand it, is entirely based upon the bias of learning it through this place. I think grad design at the AA is wholly unique to the AA right now. I think it probably was when we came in 1996 to set up the program, which was building upon the GDG course, which had been around for a couple of years, since the early 90s. And I think that's a first important point to stress. Grad design and the way we structured and created the DRL is pursued in a way that I think is fundamentally, and in fact, early on, it was quite deliberately different than the way grad design is thought at other institutions. And in fact, for me, that came largely from having taught at other places where I just thought it was pursued in incredibly uninteresting ways, particularly in schools like the GSD at Harvard. I think the Berlage, for example, if one were to have a discussion of grad design, would be thought of through a completely different set of concepts or techniques. It's a very interesting school that I've also taught grad design in, but it's fundamentally different than the way we pursue it here. And I think we could go around the world and look at grad design taught at places like Zurich at ETH or at Bob's old school at Princeton, places that I frequently visit, and in part because they work on things that we're quite interested in, but they work on them in fundamentally different ways, completely different organizations in terms of how learning and teaching take place, even within the very narrow area of work that we all might be interested in. Interestingly, I think one of the reasons grad design became so unique at a place like this is that we took experiences from, several of us took experiences from the undergraduate school and the diploma system and brought them to bear upon thinking of graduate design in a different way. My first real brief for designing the pedagogy of the DRL was to make sure, in fact, that the graduate design program here wouldn't become something like Diploma Unit 16. And I say that in the important sense that I think that isn't what the school needed at the time. The idea of simply one more unit with a slightly different group of students participating in it. What we saw at the AA was the possibility of considering grad design in a setting that could be as experimental as the kind of experiments that are going on in the undergraduate school, I think, still to this day. And to that end, what we tried to create was a structure, in fact, that allowed for a certain kind of experimental work that was, for example, deliberately collaborative in its focus, that unlike units in the undergraduate school would be working with people already trained as architects, which introduced both its own potential and its own limitations in some ways, and importantly would give us the freedom to really pursue design work, its teaching and learning in ways that aren't constrained by the kind of institutional requirements that for example, major universities or technical settings require for that sort of work. We had absolute freedom when we started working with the DRL to basically set up a program and work it the way we were interested in doing. There were very real and still are clear demands regarding the validation of the course, but the fact was we were all given an incredibly rare opportunity, I think, to first think through the design of a program before we came to the issue of the design of any of the work that would come out of that course. And my interest, certainly for the last 9 years, has been the interplay between those two features, i.e. that thinking and learning and working certain ways is inevitably going to find itself worked through in terms of some kinds of projects that can build upon the features in the way people actually work. Our interest by far was the arrival, let's say in the mid-90s, of new collaborative teaching and learning methods that are obviously not in any way restricted to architecture, and in fact connect architecture to many other disciplines of design and everyday features of life. The arrival of high-speed networks, the idea of distributed design systems like the software and hardware applications that we work with quite a lot. Most importantly, I think what we found ourselves pursuing was an interest in a kind of multiplicity within design work that inevitably required of us a completely different setting with which to work through it, i.e. that it wasn't just a topic to work on in a traditional format or even in the format of a unit system at a school like this, but that it was a topic that could in fact already be worked on through distributed and networked operations. I think the individuality of the graduate design program at a place like this school isn't really unique to its time. I went back and looked the other day as a part of a discussion that Carlos and I and Robert and Tony had on Tuesday at the unit system at the AA, and I was struck by the the way in which the graduate school has in fact always changed, and changed quite dramatically compared to the undergraduate school over the last 30 years. In 1969, the graduate departments at the AA included, for example, a program called Tropical Studies, which allowed one-year option courses in things like medical buildings, education buildings. There was a planning department at the time. There was a Department of Arts and Histories that taught a course called the History of Design, and another one that taught the Theory of Design as separate topics. And there was a very interesting department called System Studies, which sounds incredibly kind of contemporary now, 30 years later, which looked at the interplay of new information systems in relation to construction technology and building systems. If we were to go through and chart, let's say, the last generation of changes in the school, one of the striking things is the kind of core stability that the unit system provides in this school, that then the various programs in the graduate school play off of in different ways. I mean, I don't know the history in great detail, but I am struck by the way, even within the limited time that I've been around the graduate school over the last 8 or 9 years, the way in which the courses have evolved and changed, the development of the landscape urbanism program, for example, or the arrival in the last couple of years of the emergent technologies courses, both of which I think those programs will be like ours from a few years before, widely emulated and copied by other schools very soon, if they're not already. One of the many diagrams you can go look at on our website, the DRL.net website, charts the arrival of, a program like DRD in Stuttgart, or there's one in Pennsylvania now called the DDRL, the MRDL in Los Angeles. There's a kind of, people are taking the initials and mixing them up and now emailing me that we're on exhibition in places, and I think they're all just sort of mixing up the letters or something because we didn't know anything about them before. But that, I think the interest other institutions have had with the DRL in the last few years is probably just an awakening to this sort of thing that I think a place like the AA or London is absolutely privileged to work through faster than other settings, which is, of course, the impact of globalization, collaborative networks, pedagogical systems built on something other than the traditional one-to-one exchange of ideas, which drives or has driven modern architectural education for a very long time, and in fact is one of the stable aspects of even the unit system here. The final point, I think, is today would probably be to try and think through this relation between how we teach design in the DRL through the various kind of collaborative systems that we use and other approaches in the undergraduate school is that we, and I think George touched on this briefly in his presentation, we were required in incredibly harsh and sometimes painful ways to be incredibly systematic about the teaching procedures that the course is built on when we set up the DRL. That was something that all of us that were involved with it at the time were, of course, resistant to, because it was basically other people telling us we had to do certain things. One at the AA is skeptical of that sort of a situation by nature. What we found, though, interestingly, was that it actually became a real virtue and a strength of the course. The idea that we have to issue to our students when they arrive a 200-page user's manual for the course, which outlines not just all of the theoretical and pedagogical aims of the program, but also articulates whatever that year's agenda might be in the studio and the way in which design seminars, workshops, and studios fit together deliberately, is something that I think has allowed us to explore the work in the studio in ways that are simply different than the ways in which ideas are pursued in other parts of the school. Again, I don't think it's better in any sense. It simply provides a very different model for thinking and learning. What I found in having come to the DRL through the diploma school, where I was teaching for a couple of years before we started thinking about the design of this course, one of the things that I was struck by was that, of course, the students that come to a program like ours are at a place like the AA for an incredibly short period of time. I mean, 16 months from beginning to end is, in the larger context of the school, quite an abbreviated career. And I think one of the responsibilities and realities we faced was that to make that experience meaningful for those that are investing a good portion of their lives to do it, meant that we would have to actually structure the ways in which teaching and learning occur in ways that allow people to kind of, let's say, get up to speed quite quickly. And I think that's a situation that's probably exponentially increased by our fascination with certain design technologies and systems which demand quite a fair bit of expertise before they become the basis for creative thinking and exploration. So maybe just to finish there, I think the important point is that one way to think about, even through a topic like design, which let's say spans directly across graduate and undergraduate school, or in fact spans across, in various ways, really spans across all 8 programs in the graduate school, in that Histories and Theories deals with design to some effect through a different means, or the question of design is thought strategically in different manners through E&E or housing and urbanism. The interest is the way, my interest would be in trying to think through the ways in which a topic like design or its teaching pedagogy actually becomes a way to differentiate and not simply duplicate every part of the school so that it becomes a version of the other, i.e. to simply open up our consideration of those sort of things to a much broader perspective. That's maybe the one conclusion after the last 7 or 8 years of experimentation that we found, is that it's simply given us a setting over at the DRL where we can look at those sort of topics slightly differently than the rest of the school right now. And in that way, hopefully participate in a larger conversation about how to take it forward. I think I'll stop there.
Okay. I think probably because, as it were, often the problem of the relation between the graduate school and the main school is a certain kind of gap between them. It's been inevitable that in some sense this morning it's taken a slightly longer time to kind of outline some of the issues because they've taken the form for a lot of time of kind of information for the school. So I think that that's quite an interesting kind of symptom of the situation. But can we take questions or points from the floor? Under the recognition that we've not that much time, probably not as much time as when Bob says that he'll answer the last question. So, can we take points?
I was just curious if you could take a minute to talk about the potential of... Hi, my name's Tyler. I'm a Phase 2 DRL. I was just wondering if you'd take a minute to talk about the potentials for outside associations, sponsorships, and the potential funding that could come from that, and the school's traditional aversion to such things.
Sorry, outside?
Funding and sponsorship, the ability for research to expand based on other people coming in to participate by association, similar to what Alan Balfour was speaking about at his lecture.
Should I say something? I think the potential is huge. There is something here that is interesting. I mean, the AA has an history of international collaborations and exchanges that is incredibly rich. At the same time, the AA is totally allergic to any form of collaboration that constrains, that imposes from outside different rules, different ways of operating. I think these days it is possible to have partnerships and collaboration that are not constraining, and I think not only it's possible, it's absolutely necessary. I take totally Bob's point. I fully agree with the time involved, the difficulties, etc. I also don't think that's a question of trying to apply research in every single aspect of what we do, but there are areas that really require much more time, more systematic work, and resources. And those resources are not going to come from the fees, nor I think they should. And I think it is our obligation to look for funds. Now, in the housing and urbanism, for instance, we were involved for a good amount of 3 months in a collaboration with 40 institutions to submit to the European Union. It was a mega project, which we unfortunately came very, very close to get, but unfortunately didn't get. No, but the amount of time in setting up that was unbelievable. And believe me, the facilities internally to do, non-existent, and would be totally unfair to start asking our administrators, etc., to do it, because that's not part of their terms of reference at the moment. So it becomes something that one has to do in the spare time in the hope that one breaks the deadlock and bring the resources that then help to set up the structures to make this more sustainable. But I agree. I think it is important and it is possible.
Could I just make a kind of brief intervention to say that this term kind of research has been used quite a lot in the last week or so. And so my intervention really is designed simply to be helpful. I think there are probably at least 4 senses in which the term research is being used sort of within the AA. You could say that within the main school, research is used sometimes to describe the work that students do in the unit, kind of as a part of the year program. I think research is also used to describe the sort of trans-year accumulation of investigation by a unit, in which one can say the research of DIP 10 over the years has concentrated on whatever. Then, as it were, there's the research embodied in the graduate school in the work of a PhD, right? And that kind of thing. And then fourthly, there's forms of research which might have been done either by housing and urbanism or by energy and environment in the kind of normal university sense of a research project. Now, one of the difficulties of holding all those 4 senses is that I think also what's being kind of proposed is another sense. And I think one, needs to kind of think about that. If you look, for example, at the proposal for his talk, though he didn't give it, by Winnie Maas, he's really kind of saying that research is a sort of institutional element which perhaps could be used as a substitute for the unit system. So I think it's merely to say that whenever people say research, I think they should be clear kind of what it is they mean and how they see it, both in intellectual terms but also in institutional terms. Sorry, Brad.
I think also, just to build a bit on the question of research, one of the points I was trying to emphasize was to stand back a bit from the way in which the word is used, and I guess that's what always strikes me when I go visit other schools, and what they call research is something else, or in fact often quite alien to the sort of things we've been thinking about. And to emphasize instead that there's a way to approach this, and it is a remarkable generational change, which is tied up into the discourses of architecture towards a thing that many people are calling research, to the point that it's now almost a bit of a cliche. And Bob Somel has just written a small piece on what comes after research that people in America are already anxious about, because they're always trying to get to the next thing before anybody else. It's horrible. It's a funny piece, and we'll go see Bob soon. We're in LA, but it's that game of what comes next. And I think there is a fascinating change taking place where research, and this is particularly our interest in the DRL, research is a way of approaching what we do that's fundamentally different than the way architects have long approached their tasks, i.e. that there are ways of working today that are fundamentally collaborative, high-speed, network, by definition, and not by desire, but by definition multidisciplinary, in ways that are just simply fundamentally different than even just a decade ago here at a school like this. I think the reality of all of these kind of activities, and we faced it in a recent grant proposal that we've just received, because I'm slightly put off by a suggestion that people at the AA are afraid of grants and funding and research, that we have a fear of. But the fact is, these things require a long time to learn how to do also, and I think that's something that many of us are beginning to realize. We wrote a half a dozen different grants last year before finally one clicked, and in fact it was the least obvious one to get. We applied for funding through a government science foundation that basically has millions of pounds of cash sitting around looking to use creatively. And of course, because they're used to working with scientists, they get proposals to redesign molecules or something that from their point of view wasn't particularly creative. All it took was a group of architects and designers to come along and say, well, look, we're interested in the possibilities of these design technologies you're talking about, but purely through an opportunity to create or anticipate different kinds of projects or systems or buildings out of them. we were required as a part of that sort of activity not to think of collaborative work as like a nice idea, but to defend the fact that as architects we knew very little of that bigger picture. We had to go out and find commercial partners like IDEO, one of the world's industrial design leaders, or the special effects department at South Bank, which are an amazing group of people with no understanding of the sort of things we're interested in as architects, but who overlapped almost perfectly with their kind of working tools and techniques that could bring a completely different part to the discussion. Disciplines that are ordinarily far, even from our own kind of team-based work in the studio, and let us simply work on our stuff in a completely different setting. I think it isn't really aversion to that sort of thing so much as the reality of learning that there's a lot of learning that's got to take place to even be able to position yourself in the field. I think to look at the people, in fact, that are successful right now in augmented architectures or those kinds of fields, you're finding people that are basically learning how to identify their work within a very large and fuzzy area of interest, and to actually make it clear enough for people that then others will come along and say, okay, here's the funding, here are the people, here are the projects, and I think that's happening. It's just, it is a slow process. I think the point is right that Bob is making. Research is a painfully slow approach to a body of work, but that can actually be a benefit for it.
I think we should try just get rid of aversion. I don't think there is an aversion. I think there are myths. I think it's quite good that Mark has said different ways of looking at research. I don't think there is an aversion. I think everybody in the graduate school has tried to raise funds in one way or another, whether it's from the British Council or whether it's the EU. People are trying to do that. I think what Alan said, which was probably more problematic, is that if DIP 10 became the Prada unit, and DIP 5 became something else. I mean, he was being provocative. That was slightly different. I think people are willing to do that. I think in terms of the relationship between the undergraduates, I mean, Mark said at the beginning not to talk about the diploma school, but in a sense we endlessly go back to that. I think the bridge between undergraduate and graduate is the best bridge we've ever had. In the 1970s, when I was a student, we weren't allowed to talk to the graduate school. I mean, it was really as serious as that. They were in Percy Street. There were these weird lefties that Alvin wasn't quite too sure about. Don't talk to those guys. And then if you were brave, you went to the odd lecture, and it was very interesting. I think now there are collaborations. I work in housing and urbanism. I haven't done too much DRL lately, but I did at the beginning when it was being set up, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. And I think maybe what we need to do is, I think I'm sort of agreeing with George. I think there's an opportunity here to be taken. I think the graduate school probably, because you're more structured, because you've had to be more structured because of validation and so on, probably is better set for getting money from outside than the undergraduate school is. It's quite difficult to say, well, look, this is DIP 10, give us some money. It's quite difficult. I think what we need to do is possibly is make the graduate school more graduate school, whether that means that it does more research or not, trying to avoid that side of it, and the undergraduate school more undergraduate school, and then have that crossover. For instance, teaching in the graduate school, one of the things I've really tried, and we haven't managed it completely, was that I come in to teach design in the graduate school. So I do bring diploma school ideas into the graduate school. One of the things that's really interested me is that the people in housing and urbanism write some very good essays, and they look at certain urban topics which are very particular. I would love if that research into those particular topics was introduced into a design process. Now, I think that's what we've got to go for, not for the undergraduate to do research and the graduate to do research. It's for us to actually become a bit more different and then find some interesting collaborations. And I think the myths that, they are separate or not, I think there are a lot of people trying to make them together. I think the myths that we're all frightened of raising money, if we have to raise money, we'll raise money. I think we need to sort of, in a sense, lower those down a bit, because this idea that we're sitting here, just depending on fees and not thinking about it, it's not what I see. I see people talking of ways of making the place profitable all the time.
I mean, I don't disagree with that, but I wouldn't want the whole of this discussion on the relationship between the graduate school and the main school, to be kind of entirely devoted to the issue of research, because I think, there is another important level, which probably is the condition for kind of moving into some of the issues that George talked about, initially it seems to me, that there is an important aspect of the relationship, which is what you might call speculative and informal. I mean, one of the consequences of the gap between the main school and the graduate school is that, in a sense, one part of it is having a conversation about something where the other part may be having a conversation about the same thing, and there really is a need to bring the two together. I mean, just to take a very small instance, when I go to juries, I'm really sometimes appalled at the way in which the poor name of Deleuze is kind of trotted out to justify something that the student is calling a diagram, which bears absolutely not only no relation to what Deleuze says, it's actually the exact opposite. That's being thought of as somehow a representation of information. That is not what Deleuze thought a diagram is. Now we've got people in the MA program last year doing their theses on Deleuze, who know perfectly well about how the fact that for him the origins of it is in the painting of Francis Bacon. That's why Brett and I this term are trying to give a kind of lecture series on the diagram, because there really does need, there are a number of intellectual issues in the main school which really require and would benefit from, the intervention, not I think just of graduate school teachers, but, probably more importantly, graduate school students. And so, as I say, I think within this conversation, there is an important element which is both speculative and informal. It doesn't require any institutional change. It needs a kind of change of heart and a willingness to kind of bring people in at both levels, both at the main school and at the level of the graduate school.
Can I?
Yeah, sorry.
I was just saying, I mean, the reason why this conversation about the relation between the graduate and undergraduate seems to be focused on research is partly for the reasons that Mark gave before, is that we're using research in so many ways that practically everything comes within the label of research. And I think it is almost unavoidable. I think it's not incorrect to use research to refer to different types of investigation. I think what is important, and I'm totally with Carlos on that, is that one has to acknowledge the differences of the type of research that would take place within graduate school and undergraduate. The specific forms in which research inform or is informed by teaching at graduate level and undergraduate level is acknowledging that. And I think the point I was trying to make about research is that there is also the need to engage with something that is much more systematic, that requires much more time, much more rigorous in terms of investigation, and obviously requires different type of infrastructure. And part of the issue here is as well that when, for instance, just to go back to, because I mentioned the business of basic research, when Jeff talked here about the ability of the AA to do a sort of destabilizing, risky basic research 20, 30 years ago, he was referring to something that obviously happened within the unit system, doing research by other means. But some of that research, we also have to think about that today, would require different type of investigations. So that basic research that could be done perhaps in a more loose manner, if you want, some of it dealing almost with similar issues, today probably would involve and would require different types of research work. And my suggestion is that we should make an effort, with all the time that will require, to strengthen that type of work within graduate studies.
Just on that point, I mean, I feel quite strongly, you see, that the loose manner is possible in the undergraduate school. It's harder in the graduate school. And I think that is actually a very positive thing, that what can be done, whether, I wouldn't call it research, I said it in a unit talk, is units do their work.
No problem.
That's the way I put it. I didn't want to call it research. But I think there is an informality from it. There is a relationship with the RIBA, with ARB, with the idea of training architects, which is a different type of validation, which is quite different to what happens in graduate school. And I think that's to our advantage. I think it really is. I think that to be able to have that choice, even for a student to be able to have that choice, if someone actually wanted to come to the school, which used to happen and it's beginning to happen again, to be in the diploma school rather than be somewhere else because they want to spend a whole year, actually working their own topic out within a particular process. I think that's very valuable, and that difference is creative. It's not a bad difference, it's a good difference. What we don't have is the communication between the two. So I share Mark's concern, but in the same way, I can tell Mark, I teach students who don't know an architect. They don't know who people
absolutely.
are. So, if there's a problem of reading or of information, that is actually quite endemic at the moment, if you ask me. So we must find ways of communicating amongst ourselves, our different groups, but we must also find ways of communicating to the outside or being part of the conversation. In that sense, I think the graduate school is more successful at the moment of being part of debates which are outside the school than the undergraduate school is.
I would just like to comment on communication. I think communication is desirable up to a point, but you can have too much communication. When I went to the Bartlett to teach there in 1962, they were all doing Jane Abercrombie's thing. She was doing research in architectural education, and she stressed communication is very important. So we ended up that everybody was on all the committees. So every committee that met was the same committee. And we got so bored with each other that nothing was communicated.
I think also there is another question, which is, I mean, it really bears on the question, the relation between what you might call speculation and research. I always feel a bit guilty when people talk about research, because I realize, I don't do research. I mean, I kind of read, I look, I try to think, and then try and say something about it. But I'm always worried when you see those kind of, entry forms, application forms. You say, they say things like current research interests, and I always feel kind of, somewhat guilty. Like, do you say nothing, or do you say everything? And I think we need also. I mean, I truly agree with George, about it, but I think we have to do it. In a kind of AA way. There needs to be a certain kind of lightheartedness about, it's not all this serious stuff that they say in universities that they do research. They don't do research, and they don't really do anything. And research can very easily become another word for a sort of new type of quasi-bureaucrat who gets the job because they're known to be very good at getting grants. Now, if you can fathom the EU system of grants, I mean, it would take me more than a lifetime to read the documentation. So, it's still, while agreeing with the points, I mean, it should never be allowed to begin to bend intellectual inquiry. As long as it serves intellectual inquiry, I'm all for it. I think, in Bob's terms, this has to be the last. We're getting over time.
Well, this is not about research at all. It's more about the students. I just wonder if you might return to the question of just what it is for a student to do postgraduate work. I'm thinking of the kind of students who are sometimes coming to the AA from the state system, perhaps, or systems or backgrounds where they've not had quite so much money and they've wanted to come to somewhere like the AA, or they've gone through courses which have been rather positivistic or deterministic, and either they've developed a special interest, such as housing, or they want to do some historical research, or they want to investigate design itself in a way that they've not had the chance. And I wonder if it's just possible to, for a minute, to redefine that basic commitment.
What do you mean redefining the basic commitment?
Well, I'm talking about the graduate school in terms of teaching and what it is what it means for a student who's undergone 5 years training to be an architect to come to do postgraduate work in this field, as opposed to doing postgraduate work, for instance, following a BA in, let's say, history of art or technology, BSc.
I think it's difficult to generalize within the graduate, if we just take the graduate school in the at the moment. I think we attract different type of students for different type of courses. I think there are students that are coming very much with a view to acquire additional skills in a very professional sense, qualification for professional work. I think there is a considerable amount of students in the graduate school that are more involved in academic work as well as professional work, and require, this is something that one has to take into consideration, these days has become almost the standard almost everywhere, that's to get a job, not just in university, almost anywhere, you need to have graduate studies. And so that also generates a huge demand for graduate studies these days everywhere in the world. But I would say a considerable amount of our students are involved in academic life in one way or another, teaching, researching, etc. So for them, this is a possibility of pursuing a more intellectual line of work, that qualifies them to go back and work in academia. But it's very different from environment and energy to the DRL to histories and theories. The profile of students, I think, is very different. What they are expecting is very different.
And I think it's for us, it's evolving a bit. I think, I come from an older generation, where the idea of doing a graduate degree is slightly, for us, like graduating here from the 80s at the AA, like getting the AA diploma was something that some of us got around to, but most of us didn't quite actually get down to completing the course in a way where you could actually be handed the piece of paper. There was a different culture in place at the time. I think George's point is right, that the kind of globalization of the academic life of architecture, the way it's changed in the last generation, really has brought to fore a group like the ones we attract every year that are interested in the degree for a combination of reasons. Part of it is clearly professional, although a huge number of them are already qualified architects. Many come with their own offices already in place. They're not doing it for the reason that they need it to become an architect. The number I counted last night was about 41 of our first 200 students are now teaching at universities around the world. I think they do need it for that reason. Another 12 of them have or are now teaching here at the AA. Which is a pretty substantial portion, over 200, let's say. So there are many people that I think come here realizing that it is the beginning of a chance to think about architecture through a combination of professional and academic settings that I think the school is still at the forefront of. But I don't think there's a kind of hard and fast rule for it. To account for how one designs a program to accommodate that goal or another. I think the goal in our case is just simply too varied across the population. I think there absolutely is a group of people that are interested in coming to a course like ours because of the chance to very quickly and very intensely engage really the kind of forefront of a contemporary debate about issues of form, program, space, design, a new generation of design tools that haven't just changed once and dramatically in the last decade, but which are like literally evolving year to year, to the point that there are just very few places where they could go to actually learn the creative possibilities of those. And I think the AA is just one of those places that, it's been the case for a long time, where that kind of globalization plays itself out uniquely. I think that's a point Saskia Sassen makes in her book about globalization. It happens everywhere, but not equally everywhere. The complications of global changes in discourses like this really are focused on very few settings. And the AA is a unique one in that way, just because of the input and output, the flux of it. It seems to be a pretty stable trend, by the way. It isn't like we're seeing a different kind of student come over the last 8 years. It's a kind of mix of several different combinations who simply want to participate over a shorter period of time at a later stage in their career in the place.
I think that the graduate school is becoming extremely successful in kind of being able to place many of its kind of graduating students in things like kind of teaching positions. And obviously that's necessary and it's good. But I also think it's worth kind of, reflecting that, the AA would not want that to be the sole kind of justification. If one distinguishes, sometimes in history and theory, you can distinguish between the student who's perhaps going to academically do best in the marks, as against the student for whom, as it were, the year's experience will have, a creative effect on them. Quite often, if you have, instead of accepting someone when they've just finished because they're doing it because they want to be a teacher. Often from a teacher's point of view, a much more rewarding student is someone who's been in practice for, say, anything from 5 to 10 years.
Most of the students that are involved in academic life, and it's not that they are purely involved in academic life, I think 90% of our students go back to practice, to professional practice. And so if you ask, I fully agree with Mark on that. I mean, and I think what they gain here is they always confirm that is extremely useful in terms of their work as professionals. But the academic requirements also count in terms of the need to do master courses, etc.
Okay, well, this has only really begun to kind of open up the question of the relationship. And I think, as I say, that, you know, a lot of it is that neither sides kind of know enough about each other. I mean, somehow that itself ought to lead to more emphasis on a kind of internal communication. I mean, students in the main school ought to know, I think, like all the topics which are being done in theses by students in the graduate school, because they might be able to kind of gain something useful from them, and that is just a model for other kinds of relationships. I'd like to thank everyone. I'd like to thank the contributors, and thank you.